Chooch. All right, Brubs, we're back with Buried Alive, the terrifying history of our most primal fear. Put that aside. These out of the way. I believe we're on chapter 6. Yeah. See how long this is? Security coffins. So it's not that long. 137. Guess it's 19 pages. It's long enough. Hello, Brubs. Hey, look up this clock, Linden, and see how. Can you hear it ticking? Look it up and see how long a wind up lasts. It says Linden, I believe. I don't know what this is. Is that the. Oh, I think that's the alarm. Is that Linden or Linder? I think it says Linden. Linden. I need to Google that, or somebody needs to Google it and see how long a wind up lasts. Like I said, I haven't wound this thing up in forever. I think it's a Japanese clock. Does that say Japan? Gotta get it at the right angle. Focus. Focus. Come on. Linden. Linden. It's one of those old travel alarm clocks. It folds up. It goes into like a little case. No, I have not wound this thing up in minimally a month. I handled it about a month ago. See, it's a little travel case, and then you go like this. Open her up. And I definitely know that it wasn't ticking earlier today because I took a shower after I cut the grass, and it was not ticking when I walked in there. I could hear it across the room as soon as I put my bookshelf up there, so very strange. Anyway, chapter 6, security coffins. Also, look at this. I keep noticing on the video front that it kind of looks like a head. Like this is the hair. You gotta look at it from far away. Turn off the thing. It's one of those Salvador Dali kind of things. Toot for cash. That's about the dumbest fucking thing I've ever heard. You piece of garbage. Ever talk to me like that again. You don't come into the grand champion's room and act like a fucking buffoon. Chapter 6, security coffins. Is that light on? It is. And, oh no, I lost my, come on, focus. Security coffins, and there they saw their daughter as the moonbeams on her fell, in her narrow coffin sitting, ringing that solemn bell. Mrs. Seba Smith, the life-preserving coffin. Columbian Ladies and Gentlemen's Magazine, January 1844. That's hilarious, buddy. You've reached the pinnacle of fucking abject stupidity. As we know, the two greatest objections to the German waiting mortuaries were that they cost a fair amount of money to build and maintain, and that many people found them more than a little sinister and unpleasant. As the early enthusiasm for these hospitals for the dead paled, many Germans even went so far as to break the law to keep the bodies of their deceased relatives away from the loathsome corpse beds of the Leichenhaus. No. Some of the German anti premature burial propagandists took up their cause, and admitted that the mortuaries had their faults. It was an undignified way to treat the dead, exposing them to a humid atmosphere among rows of other putrefying corpses. I'm so done with people from nowadays. They're imbeciles. Particularly if not only relatives of the dead, but also various paying visitors were strolling about at will. Furthermore, the truly overpowering stench emanating from the larger Leichenhauser was a serious sanitary hazard. They claimed by the 1790s an alternative way of safeguarding against the dreaded shine toad, Todd, had been suggested, the security coffin. The earliest example of an attempt to construct such a coffin involves none less than Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick, the ruler of one of the German states. The Duke had read about the horrors of premature burial, and in good time before his death in 1792, he ordered some skilled carpenters to construct a special coffin. It had a window that let in light, an air hole to prevent suffocation, and a lid with a lock and key mechanism instead of being nailed down. The Duke had a pair of keys put in a special pocket in the shroud, one for the coffin lid and the other for the vault door. Right. Security coffins, as advanced as the one manufactured at Duke Ferdinand's orders, were completely out of reach for ordinary people. It was also a much more difficult task to construct a security coffin that safeguarded against premature burial in an ordinary grave in the churchyard than to do so for burial in a vault. But this did not prevent various enthusiastic inventors from suggesting alternative devices. P.G. Pessler, a German village person, came up with a novel idea in 1798. He suggested that every time a coffin was buried in the churchyard, a hollow tube should be connected to it. A rope leading to the nearby church bell should be passed down through this tube so that this prematurely buried individual could make his or her resurrection known by ringing a merry peal of celebration. That's insane. How long is this fucking rope? The parson's plan did not take into account either the weight of the bell or the feebleness of the poor wretch in the narrow box underground. Pastor Beck, a colleague of his, instead recommended that an opening in the coffin be fitted with strings, bells, and an air hole. Another well meaning German cleric suggested that all buried coffins be fitted with a tube looking rather like a ship's speaking trumpet. The local parson should take a stroll through the churchyard every morning and stop by each recent grave to ascertain, through the sense of smell, whether the putrefaction of the body was sufficiently well advanced to permit the tube to be withdrawn. If there was a lack of putrid odor, the coffin should be disinterred after a few days for inspection by a doctor. If the person was startled by a cry of "Hilf!" through the speaking trumpet, the disinterment should, of course, be performed more expediently. An undated German plate showing a curious apparatus to save prematurely buried people, not unlike that described by Pastor Pessler. The inventor Johann Georg Hypeli disagreed with these ideas. The sick and feeble, prematurely buried person did not have the strength to shout through the speaking trumpet or to pull the bell rope. Anyway, at night, when the watchman slept, no person was on guard to hear the feeble peal of the frantically ringing bells. He instead proposed that a powerful mechanical alarm bell be put in each larger cemetery and that each coffin be equipped with a special contraption just above the head of the deceased. Any person buried alive would instinctively try to sit up, Hypeli wrote, and the resounding bang as the forehead met the coffin lid would trigger the release of a string that set the bell ringing. The defect of this method was that the coffin had no air hole, but Hypeli was probably an adherent of the theory that the apparently dead could survive or even wake up in the coffin without access to fresh air. He stressed the low cost of his invention. Just 2 or 3 bells would suffice for a large cemetery, fewer than that even among poor people, if they were fitted on high greased poles to keep people from stealing them. A feeble old man could be given a shed to live in just underneath the bell. I mean, that's a fucking great idea. Hey, feeble old man, lay in this shack underneath the bell, thus saving the cost of a proper watchman. Yeah, until you hear the sound and then you couldn't dig the person up. Many ideas like these cropped up in the 1790s when the concern for the apparently dead was at its height in the German states. It was even suggested that only very light coffins be used, and that each buried person have an axe and a spade in the coffin, thereby enabling him or her, it was hoped, to tunnel a way up to rejoin the rest of humanity. Even the kindly Hufeland had to admit that these notions gave more credit to the Christianity and philanthropic zeal of these German persons than to their intelligence and sense of practicality. The first invention of a security coffin that had any serious claim to practicality was that of Adolf Gutsmuth, the city physician in Seehausen in Altmark. In 1822, he presented a security coffin of his own design that had a long tube linking the buried coffin with the world above. Through this tube, air and light could be admitted into the coffin if the person inside triggered a mechanism. An extra advantage was that it was also possible to administer food and drink to the prematurely buried person by means of another tube inside the larger one. While the coffin was being exhumed, the heroic Dr. Gutsmith tested his coffin by having himself buried alive in it under 5 feet of firmly stamped earth. He was dug up after an hour, alive and well, thanks to his security system. His next project was even more hazardous. He had himself put into a tightly sealed coffin in order to find out exactly how long a person could live after being buried alive. The outcome is unfortunately not known, except that Dr. Gutsmith survived. He was again buried alive in a security coffin later in 1822. This time, he stayed underground for several hours and had a meal of soup, beer, and sausages served through the coffin's feeding tube. He then made a philanthropic speech through a speaking trumpet that had been fitted to the coffin. It is reported that this speech could be clearly heard by a crowd of earnest, well-dressed, respectable spectators standing around the doctor's premature grave. This is another brilliant story. In 1827, another German practitioner, Dr. von Hess of Neustrelitz in Mecklenburg, presented an improved version of Dr. Gutsmith's coffin. From the lid of the buried coffin, 2 detachable tubes, 13 by 5 feet long and 1 by 5 inches in diameter, extended up to ground level. The one mounted by the head end of the coffin had a speaking trumpet that allowed the prematurely buried person to call for help. It was also possible to ring a bell mounted on top of the tube. Dr. von Hess tried out his coffin in the same way as Dr. Gutsmith. He was buried alive in it under 5 feet of earth, without becoming a martyr to science, but also without attracting as much publicity as had his eccentric fellow practitioner. The Hanoverian Dr. Johann Georg, or is it George? George Taberger thought that Dr. von Hess and other inventors had approached the subject too lightly. He criticized the impractical schemes they proposed. A weak, sick individual who had just awakened from a cataleptic trance could hardly pull ropes to see heavy bells in motion, or call for help in a stentorian voice that echoed through the churchyard. Nor could one compare the live burial of a strong, fully conscious man to that of a paralyzed, speechless wretch awakening in a coffin. This individual would have neither the power nor the wits to pull strings, open tubes, or work intricate mechanisms. Dr. Taberger's own security coffin left nothing to chance. The corpse had strings tied around its head, hands, and feet, and these were connected with a rope that led up through a tube, reaching a bell on top of it. The slightest movement of the individual in the coffin would set the bell in motion. The security coffin had many clever technical details that testified to the Teutonic thoroughness of its inventor. The bell was surrounded by a housing that kept the wind or birds from settling into motion. Setting it into motion. Pardon? A fine meshwork inside the tube prevented insects. Let's take a look at this. The security coffin described by Dr. Johann Gottfried Taberger, in his book Der Scheintod, Hanover, 1829. The slightest movement of the hands, feet, or head would ring the bell in the belfry above the grave. Right. A fine meshwork inside the tube prevented insects from flying or crawling down to annoy the prematurely buried person. A cunning drainage system was to prevent rainwater from dripping down the tube, and thus from adding the Chinese water torture to the horrors of a premature tomb, not tube. Most important, the security tube was permanently open to admit air, and a praiseworthy gesture of early environmentalism. Dr. Taberger recommended that a sponge soaked in talcum of chlorine be thrust into the tube to reduce the efflux of putrefaction fumes from the coffin's chimney. If the bell was triggered by the prematurely buried person, a second security tube could be inserted at the foot end of the coffin by the use of a powerful bellows. Air circulation, which was thought to be very beneficial for further restoring the dormant life of its luckless inhabitant, could be achieved inside the coffin. Dr. Taberger hoped that a collection of money among philanthropic Germans would enable all vergers to purchase a supply of his security tubes, which were very cheap and reusable. The only drawback which he could not in any way remedy was that a watchman had to be on duty day and night in each cemetery. Otherwise, the frenzied ringing of the poor wretch underground would have little effect. The 1820s saw an attempt to combine the idea of the waiting mortuary with that of the security coffin, the so-called portable death chamber. This was a small lichen house built for just one inhabitant, with a hermetically sealed door with a window. A string led from the corpse's hand to a bell on top of the death chamber. The plan was to employ a corps of gravediggers and watchmen in each cemetery. They would go on regular rounds to inspect the corpses through the windows of the death chambers and emerged on top of each grave, and be ready around the clock to resuscitate each corpse that rang the bell. If there were clear signs of putrefaction, a trapdoor in the bottom of the death chamber would be triggered, and the corpse would fall down into a previously dug grave underneath it. A second door could then be inserted in lieu of the coffin lid. A contraption of this sort was actually in regular use in Eberstadt and Gotha. A report in the civic archives of Weimar, the site of the first Leichenhaus in Germany, criticized it severely. A paralyzed, speechless victim of the Scheintod, who did not even have the power to ring the bell, would be disposed of in the most cruel fashion and dumped into a premature grave by the same hands that had been employed to save him or her. In the second half of the 19th century, the German obsession with security coffins continued, and upwards of 30 different versions were patented. A certain Richard Strauss from Schweidnitz in Silesia constructed several security coffins of increasingly advanced design. One had a filter to keep sand and air from falling into the face of the prematurely buried person, and a patent lamp that could be lit inside the coffin. Another had a complete air conditioning system. That's brilliant. With a powerful pump and a filter through which the air was recirculated. The crowning touch was that the bell was replaced with a powerful firecracker. Wouldn't it be cold down in the earth anyway? 6 feet down. By whose detonation that the prematurely buried person could make his or her resurrection known even in a large and desolate cemetery. What was that story that I wanted to save? Is that right here? There it is. Got to save it, bro. I got you. I got you, buddy. What? This is brilliant. The crowning touch was that the bell was replaced with a powerful firecracker, by whose detonation the prematurely buried person could make his or her resurrection known, even in a large and desolate cemetery. Wouldn't that fucking blow them up? The products of other imaginative German inventors included the mechanical brass hammer that smashed the glass pane in the coffin lid, a pyrotechnical rocket that was launched through the security tube of the coffin, and a loud siren mounted inside the tube. This latter variant also had a similarly penetrating siren in the other end of the tube, which could be used as a last resort, its blasts echoing in the narrow coffin. If the corpse did not respond to this final wake-up call, the tube was to be withdrawn. Britons, who wanted to ensure themselves against being buried in a state of apparent death, could order coffins equipped with the Bateson life revival device, an iron bell mounted in a miniature campanile on the lid of the casket. The bell rope connected to the presumed corpse's hands through a hole in the coffin lid. Bateson's belfry, as it was called, was of course most useful before burial, but those wealthy and cautious enough could have the apparatus buried with them. The Victorian gentleman may have hoped that, should he revive in his padded coffin, the sinister underground knelling from the belfry would call some attentive verger or gravedigger to the rescue, and that the coffin would be unearthed and the creaking lid opened by a polite servant with the words, "You rang, sir?" George Bateson, whose belfry was patented in 1852, was a successful inventor and mechanic. He described his security device as a most economical, ingenious, and trustworthy mechanism superior to any other method in promoting a peace of mind amongst the bereaved of all stations of life. Quite a few security devices were sold, and Bateson was awarded the Order of the British Empire by Queen Victoria for his services to the dead. According to some accounts, Bateson later became more and more preoccupied with the horrors of premature burial. He built increasingly complicated alarm systems for his own coffin. Two drawings of another German security coffin. There's the tube, and there's whatever the hell that is. Might as well look at this one while we're... A drawing for a coffin with safety springs that made the lid swing open if the mechanism was triggered by its inhabitant. From the Burial Reformer magazine of October through December 1911. How the hell would it swing open, though, if it was underground? Oh. Anyway. Not trusting even his own apparatus, he later rewrote his will, instead asking to be cremated. Finally, the wretched man became quite insane and feared that his directions would not be followed. In a fit of desperation, he doused himself with linseed oil and set himself ablaze in his workshop, preferring a premature cremation to the lingering risk of premature burial. A later British invention was a security coffin with a lid fitted with powerful springs for use in vault burials. There also exist drawings for a coffin with an ejection seat, but it does not seem to have been manufactured. I mean, how big is this fucking vault? And how far is this guy going to get flung out of the coffin? In the United States, at least 22 patients for security coffins were applied for between... Patents, not patients, for security coffins were applied for between 1868 and 1925. Some of them by optimistic Germans who wanted a worldwide market for their coffins, but the majority by American inventors. The earliest application was filed in August 1868 by Franz Vester of Newark, New Jersey, a German-American who had brought his enthusiasm for saving apparently dead people with him to his new country. His security coffin remains unique in the annals of these inventions. The coffin lid had a sliding door to which was fitted a detachable hollow cylinder with a ladder bolted to it. That's brilliant. A security coffin designed by Mr. Franz Vester of Newark, New Jersey, and patented on August 25th, 1868. On awakening, the prematurely buried person was supposed to ring the bell by means of the rope. If this failed to produce results, he should climb up through the square tube attached to the coffin lid by means of the ladder. The inventor had clearly not counted on his fellow Americans' inclination toward stoutness. Most of them would have got stuck when attempting such a maneuver. I'll read this one while I'm doing this. A security coffin with a bell and an air hole, designed by Mr. August Lindquist of Charlton, Iowa, and patented on June 20th, 1893. Upon recovery, the apparently dead person would presumably crawl through the opening, climb up the ladder, open another door, and thus re-enter the world of light. If, on the other hand, he got stuck halfway, he did not have to wait the enforced slimming cure needed to reduce his girth. He could ring a bell mounted outside the tube to call for assistance. The coffin contained a box of food. The coffin contained a box of food and wine, which he could enjoy while ringing for the sexton. Hey, let me have a bit of wine while I wait to be unburied. The detachable tube could be removed, and the sliding door closed if, on later inspection, life was again proven to be extinct. Following the proud tradition of Dr. Gutsmith and Dr. von Hess, Fritz Vester decided to try his coffin out himself. Although his residence in the United States had diluted his philanthropy toward prematurely buried fellow humans and instead produced a healthy dose of financial astuteness, it is recorded that 500 paying New Yorkers saw one of his shows and that Vester stepped into his coffin with more alacrity than could be expected of a man about to submit to so grave an experiment. A little girl put a flower wreath on his head before the coffin lid was screwed down. Why the fuck would you screw it down? And a brass band played a mournful tune as the coffin was lowered into a 6-foot deep grave. After an hour, Vester was dug up and the crowd rushed forward to embrace and congratulate him. The punny newspaper reporter quoted earlier added that Vester did not at all appear decomposed by his sojourn underground. The later American patent coffins became increasingly advanced, featuring various electrical signals triggering flags, bells, and rotating lights. The most elaborate ones even had an electric light, a heater, and a telephone. There were untrue rumors that Mary Baker Eddy had purchased a coffin equipped with a telephone and later been buried in it, but at least one of her fellow Americans became a customer. In 1908, a wealthy Louisiana lady named Mrs. Penord, who greatly feared a live burial, was buried in a security vault equipped with air holes, and a telephone connected to the cemetery's keeper's house was put on her bedside table. Count Michael D. Carnegie, a chamberlain to Tsar Nicholas II and a doctor of law at the University of Louvain, was a distinguished Russian nobleman who spent much of his time in France and Italy. His family came from Warsaw, but he had independent financial means and could travel about Europe as he wanted. The Count's carefree life was changed, however, by a horrific experience while he was attending the funeral of a young Belgian girl. When the first shovels of earth were thrown upon her coffin, she awoke from her death trance, and her piteous screams haunted him ever since. He decided to invent a mechanical apparatus to save the lives of those prematurely buried. His first invention was a coffin with a large glass pane in the lid, which could be opened or smashed by the prematurely buried person. This security coffin was, of course, only useful for a vault burial, but the Count's labors continued. He wanted to invent a security coffin suitable for burial in the earth, which he intended to make available to rich and poor alike. After several years of hard work, Count D. Carnegie was able to present a particularly advanced security coffin, eponymously called Le Carnis, before an international audience at the Sorbonne in 1897. Beforehand, he had patented it both in Europe and in the United States. The idea was that every time someone was buried, a long tube 3.5 inches in diameter was to be connected with an aperture in the coffin, the end of its emerging above ground, rather like the periscope of a submarine. A visit to one of the German waiting mortuaries had given Count de Carnicki a healthy respect for the foul miasma that the putrefying corpse exuded, and a metallic box attached to the top of the tube was closed to the outside world to keep the gases from the coffin from escaping. The slightest movement of the chest or arms of the corpse in its coffin would set off an intricate mechanism which would open the tube to admit air into the coffin. At the same time, a bell would ring and a flag wave on top of the mechanism, which bore some resemblance to an American mailbox. This would, it was hoped, call the diligent vergers, or is it vergers? Vergers and gravediggers to the rescue. Apparently, Lee Carnice worked quite well when tried out at the Sorbonne before a large gathering of foreign ambassadors, medical men, hygienists, and gentlemen of the press, many of whom praised the philanthropic zeal of the Russian nobleman. In the Journal d'Hygiene, several authors agreed that Count D. Carnicki's security coffin was superior to any such earlier contraption, and that it should be widely used to prevent premature burials. Les Carnis, a before and after sketch of Count D. Carnicki's invention, being triggered by a man buried alive. The influential Parisian hygienist Professor Charles Richet told the press that the problem of apparent death was no more and that the lethargy had been vanquished by Les Carnis. Count de Carnis Carnicki then went on a road show through France and Belgium to demonstrate his security coffin. The initial reactions to his invention were positive, but one of the later demonstrations was not a success. The Count had arranged for an assistant to be buried alive in a coffin fitted with Les Carnis. This individual was to trigger the mechanism after spending a few minutes underground, but the flag did not wave and the bell did not ring, and the audience grew increasingly nervous. Consternation could be observed on the faces of Count D. Carnis Carnicki and his associates. They grabbed their shovels and started digging frenziedly. Fortunately, it turned out that the air hole had been functional, and the intrepid assistant could climb out of the coffin unaided. Some journalists were present at the ill-fated demonstration, and the faint aura of ridicule that had plagued the Count's invention from the start now erupted in ribald articles in the Paris Boulevard newspapers. Some of the experts who had previously praised Les Carnis now recanted, admitting that a security coffin that worked only sometimes was not a very valuable invention. Focus. This failure would have crushed a less determined man, but Count de Carnis Carnicki continued his crusade undaunted. He held several further demonstrations of the coffin and badgered numerous medical societies and academies for their approval. The Count's French agent, M. Emile Camille, wrote to the newspapers to say that those individuals who had tried to belittle Les Carnis should be ashamed of themselves for their mean and spiteful attacks on the magnanimous, philanthropic Russian. He claimed that Count de Carnis Carnicki had no fewer than 4 times been able to prevent the burial of people stricken with lethargy, and that this accomplishment, if nothing else, should give credit to his claim that a mechanical apparatus to prevent premature burials was urgently needed. The road show went on to Berlin, Brussels, London, and Milan. When it came to Turin, the Count arranged a bizarre demonstration. This fucker stop? No, it's still going. A 78-year-old man named Fatapo Lorenzo had consented to be buried alive in Les Carnis. Buried on December 17, 1898, he was not disinterred again until December 26th. Signor Lorenzo's only comment when dug up after this dreary underground Christmas vacation was that it had been damn smelly down there. The prefect of Milan and the inspector of cemeteries were so impressed by this demonstration that they awarded the Count a signed certificate that his coffin was fully functional. To argue his case further, Count de Carnis Carnicki wrote a pamphlet entitled Vie au Mur. The Count's prose was rather bombastic and florid. For example, he wrote that premature burial was such a torture that it made all the torments that the Romans inflicted on the Christians at the circus in Rome seem mild by comparison. He deplored the flippant journalist who had made fun of him and blasted the conniving funeral directors who had promised to order coffins but failed to make good their promises. Worst of all were Dr. Laborde and Dr. Vallon, 2 French hygienists who had presented a scathing report on Les Carnis to the Académie des Médecins in Paris. They had argued that the mechanism, I'm having such trouble with that word, mechanism, was too sensitive and could easily be triggered by putrefactive changes. That's true. I mean, I don't know if they embalmed people back then, so I assume that rigor mortis set in and that they continued. But the Count emphasized that even the most feeble, paralyzed creature should be able to maneuver the coffin. Moving to statistics, he claimed on the authority of the American physician Dr. Carlton Simon that 1 person out of 30,000 buried was still alive when put into the earth, he contrasted this dubious figure to another one, which he had found in a French newspaper. Only 1 out of 11 million railway passengers was killed. Surely it was more dangerous to be buried than to travel by train. And it was thus a monstrous inconsistency of the French government to improve railway safety while scoffing and deriding those earnest, uncomplaining philanthropists who cared for the apparently dead. In December 1899, Les Carnis was taken to the United States by the enterprising M. Camus, who gave a lecture on its merits before the Medico Legal Society of New York. The American medical profession was so impressed with the Count's invention that a special committee of the Medical Legal Society of New York, chaired by Dr. H. Gerald Chapin, reported that there was ample cause to fear that premature burials occurred frequently and that nothing but the systematic use of Les Carnis could prevent them. The Detroit physician Dr. Noah E. Arenstam, who had been present when Les Carnis was examined by the Medico Legal Society, also wrote an article to recommend its use. For several years, one of the prototypes of Les Carnis was exhibited in a showroom at 835 Broadway, but the American funeral directors were not particularly impressed with it. Probably the word had spread from Europe that the mechanism was much too sensitive, that it did not allow for even the slightest movement of the corpse during decomposition. Bill Jerome Les Carnis, a very detailed sketch from a French advertisement pamphlet for Count de Carnicki's invention. We today know much more about human physiology than the early 19th century inventors did, and this allows us to point out some glaring defects in the construction of the 19th century security coffins. First, a person enclosed in a normal-sized, airtight coffin, the lid of which had been screwed down, would perish within 60 minutes because of the lack of oxygen. The security coffins that lacked a permanent air supply would thus fulfill their purpose only if the apparently dead individual regained consciousness within an hour, which was probably not the intention of their inventors. For any person whose state of Scheintod lasted longer than 60 minutes, the security device would certainly prevent the disagreeable experience of awakening in a coffin, but at the price of killing the client from suffocation. The security coffin designed by Dr. Tabager and the majority of the late 19th century ones had a permanent air supply and would thus allow their apparently dead inhabitants to survive much longer. But Dr. Tabager's coffin had another serious defect. We now know that the putrefactive changes of a corpse are accompanied by swelling of the abdomen as a result of gas formation within the abdomen, and also by contractures of the arms and legs of a variable degree. This process would certainly set off the mechanism of the coffin, whose bell strings were actually tied to the corpse's head, hands, and feet. Les Carnis had a similar defect, its sensitive mechanism being positioned where it could easily be triggered by the putrefactive changes. Both Dr. Taberger and Count de Carnicki held that the mechanism had to be triggered by the slightest movement, conjuring up a vision of horror as the paralyzed victim of the Cheyenne Toad. Todd desperately tried to move a finger to call for assistance, but this excessive concern instead made their coffins practically useless. The false alarms resulting from putrefactive changes of the corpses buried in coffins equipped with these forms of security devices would have led to many distasteful and distressing scenes in the cemeteries, with bells ringing and little flags waving on the mailboxes, had either of them been used to any extent. The optimal security coffin would thus have a permanent air supply and an alarm mechanism that demanded intelligent effort. Like the turning of a handle, The later models with electrical wiring to a bell in the cemetery office were particularly useful, since they disposed of the necessity of having a watchman patrolling the cemetery day and night. But despite all the rhetoric of Dr. Gutsmith, Dr. Taberger, Count de Carnice Carnicki, and other inventors of security coffins, the idea never really caught on. The parsimonious and utilitarian elements stood united to condemn such needless expenditure, and the supporters of the Lichen House movement viewed the various attempts to invent security coffins as a betrayal of Hufelin's noble and philanthropic idea. Les Carnices was marketed in many countries, but in spite of the determined efforts of Count de Carnice Carnicki, few coffins were actually sold. The ultimate reason for the failure of the security coffins to go into serial production must be sought in the field of psychology rather than in that of mechanics. The intended customers for the security coffins, people fearful of premature burial who wanted a safeguard at any price, were concerned not with the alarms that would sound if the mechanism was triggered by putrefactive changes, but rather with the risk of the coffin's mechanism not operating properly, thus consigning its luckless denizen to a horrible death. After all, a person could stay alive for a long time in a coffin with an air supply, screaming and frantically pulling the faulty mechanism in a desperate attempt to communicate with the world above. What would happen if the coffin's mechanism jammed, or the strings came off in the trembling hand that pulled them? What horrors would ensue if some mischievous youth stole the mailbox above earth, or if the cemetery watchman decided to take a nap instead of patrolling his beat, leaving the bell to ring and the flag to wave jerkily until finally they came to a halt as the apparently dead person, seized with despair, tore his hair and frantically grappled with the unyielding walls of the narrow prison. Funny thing was, later, in the age of the, what were they called? The grave robbers. There was a name for it. Anyway, they built security coffins to prevent these people from digging them up. I think there were some that exploded, and can't remember what the other ones did. But yeah, what were they called? The resurrectionists. So yeah, bruvs. That's the end of chapter 6. All right, bruv. Goodbye. Guten Abend.